Great, good to go. Thank you for having me. My name is Greg Rogers. I live in Asheville. I have Hawk Creek Honey Company, and this year will be my 40th year of beekeeping. So I've been doing it for a while. I have about 340 to 350 hives right now. I've had as high as 400, but I'm happy with that level, about 350. And so y'all asked me to come talk about spring management. I'm just going to throw a lot of stuff at you about what I do, various different things that I do for spring management to try to give you some ideas. So I brought this because this kind of, it's easiest for me just to show you what I do rather than show you 5 different ways of doing things. I just show you what I do, and then you can pick up some ideas from that. I know people have different configurations of beehives, but I'll pretty much show you how I do it. Years ago, I settled on doing a deep and a medium for my, my basic wintertime hive is a deep and a medium. I've stuck with that for a long time now. I tried double deeps. The biggest problem I had with them was half the time the upper brood body was full of honey, and I just didn't want to lift 80-pound boxes to get down and do the management of the hive in the bottom. Didn't have a crew working with me, doing it all myself. I tried double deeps. I tried a deep and a medium. I've tried a deep and a shallow. The deep and the medium I think works the best out of all those for my purposes. Deep and a shallow. The shallow ended up with just a little too much drone brood in it, I noticed, but a deep and a medium seems to work perfectly. They raise a nice brood nest in both boxes, and so that's kind of what I arrived at finally. So I have a system where I'm picking up the pallets with a little boom on my truck. And so that's why I have this system where it's 2 hives on a pallet instead of 4. It sits back to back with 2 other hives, but that's how I do it. I don't move them much anymore. I used to do a lot of apple pollination. I used to move bees for sourwood quite a bit. Now I don't move them as much, but I still have them on these 2 hive pallets. So it's kind of a pallet type system for how I do it. And much like most people that have pallets, they usually have a block here on the pallet and there, so that your entrance is skewed over to this side or over to that side, and it's just because there's less fighting between the bees. These 2 hives sit pretty close together, so that's typical of a pallet. And I would have this block on year-round, this larger block, and then usually in August, right about the time we harvest the sourwood honey, I reduce the entrance down further to where it's only about 4 inches wide. August, you get a lot of robbing, or you can get. So I tend to reduce it down to about 4 inches. I know some people reduce their entrances even further than that, but that's what I've been happy with that result and not had much trouble robbing. And then when the weather gets cold in October, I also add a 1/2-inch hardware cloth screen to keep the mice out. So that's kind of what the winter configuration looks like. I staple that down where the mice can't get in, and that would be my basic winter hive. So it's really best to talk about spring management by talking about a little bit of fall management first, and then it kind of leads into the spring. So I've removed all the honey, and I use these as a feeder in the fall. I have one of these Man Lake feeders for every hive. They hold about 3 gallons of feed, which is a large amount. I usually feed 2 to 3 gallons in August and 2 to 3 gallons more in September, and maybe a little bit in October. And so as long as the weather is still warm enough, that feeder works very well for feeding. So I'll just quickly kind of go over what I did in the fall and give you an idea, and then how that leads into winter and the spring here. I'm like most commercial beekeepers. I've learned with varroa mites and viruses, our best thing to do now is to treat a lot. It used to be we thought we could get away with just treating in August for varroa mites and we were done for the year. We're learning now that that's really not possible. That the bees need a lot more treatment than that. So my strategy this year was I treated with a treatment in August, and I've treated with a different treatment in September. I treated with the Apiguard, the thymol gel, in August. I did it 3 times instead of 2, split it into 3 treatments of about 40 grams. So that the treatment was spread out for an entire month, all through August. And then in September, I followed it up with the Amatraz strips in the hive as a second treatment, because in September, I think we get some reinfestation from other people's beehives. In the county I live in, we have a huge number of hobby beekeepers, and a lot of them don't treat their bees, and I know we're getting mite immigration from other people's beehives, so that's why I've gone to doing both an August and a September treatment, 2 different things. You could do it other different combinations. You could do the thymol, you could do the formic acid. Just kind of watch what the temperature requirements are of the different treatments to decide, but I think it's better than just treating in August. And then I followed it up. Like I said, I did 2 feedings, really tried to feed them where they're good and heavy. Ideally, this top medium box will be completely full of honey plus the sugar syrup stores, and even some of the bottom box. If I say what's the ideal leading into winter, I'd say I did so-so on that this year. Looking at it now, I probably could have fed every hive 2 more gallons than what I gave them. It's part of, as you know, part of keeping bees in Western North Carolina is we get almost no fall flow from anything in terms of nectar. So that's why we have to do quite a bit of feeding in the fall to get them ready for winter. I followed it up with the oxalic vapor in December. We started out just doing it 1 time. Now I'm like Bob, I did it 3 times. I did it 3 times starting the first week of December, going until around Christmas. I hit them 3 different times, each of the hives, with the oxalic acid vapor. And it's an easy time of year to work on the hives. You're not having to open the hives to do it. I used a heavier dose. I used about a 4-gram dose, which is a full teaspoon or a little bit more than a full teaspoon on each of the 3 treatments, and I did that in December. So I think the research backs that up. Several places they've done the research, and it's the December treating with the oxalic, you have the chance to get the mites to the absolute lowest level that you will get them in the entire year. None of the other treatments, even the chemical treatments, you can't get them that low, but you can get them very low. So I did it 3 times, and it seemed to work pretty well. So I did, lots of treatment, lots of feeding. Came through better this year. Had much lower loss. I would guess I did double the treatment this year than in 2021. I probably did double the Varroa treatment that I had done the year before, and the results showed that really helped. At least I can claim that had something to do with it. We never know, but it seemed to. I had very low losses this year compared to last year, and overall the hives they look pretty good. So the other thing I did for the first time this winter that I had not done before is I used this insulation just on the top of the hives. It's this stuff called Reflectix. It's got a bubble wrap in the middle with foam on both sides. Because I use these migratory covers to move my bees around, there's no vent hole in these covers, and so there's no way for the air to vent out the top of the beehive. I was having trouble with condensation on the underside of the cover in the wintertime. And I'd been reading and watching some videos, people talking about this stuff. Goes right on the hive just like that. And your cover goes right on. There's no top ventilation. So that might sound a little, like against what you've heard with beekeeping. But the idea is that with the top being insulated like that, if there's any warm moisture-laden air comes to the top, it doesn't condense on the top, and it doesn't drip back onto the bees because you have that insulation there. If anything, it'll condense. The air will go down the side of the hive and condense the water more on the sides of the hive than on the top. And that's fine because then the bees can actually go over there and get the moisture. There was a great article in the Bee Journal a couple years ago that was talking about this whole concept. It's called The Condensing Hive, so you can check that out and read it. But anyway, I've looked at all the beehives and they look great. I really like what I've seen with using that on the top of the hives. There was little or no condensation at all. The bees seem to really like it. In fact, a lot of times when I peel the aluminum back, they're clustered right up against it, like they like the warmth. So I've been impressed by what I've seen, where they're not hitting that cold cover at the top. So for whatever it's worth, you might try that. But that's basically my winter hive that went through the winter like that, mouse guard, insulation, whatnot. So first inspection. This year we had a lot of cold weather in January. It was a very cold month. After a very warm December, we ended up with a really cold January, which I was glad to see, actually. Kept the bees in a really dormant state. So I didn't get around to my first inspections. I did them on February 9th, 10th, and 11th. We got a little warm spell there in early February, and I made it out and did my first inspection. And so essentially what I was doing on that first inspection, which is about a month ago now, it was very quick. I was going in. It was a warm, sunny day. And I really just wanted to find out a couple of simple things about each hive. First of all, I simply wanted to check and see if each hive was alive, dead or alive. Because in early February, if you have hives that die, they haven't been if there's quite a bit of honey in them, they haven't been robbed out yet. So it's a nice opportunity to quickly close the hive up, keep them from getting robbed out. So what I did then on the dead hives is I just took the screen off, took a foam plug like that, shoved it in the entrance where the robber bees couldn't get in there, and then I stapled my screen back on like that. And I still have some of them that are sitting like that, though this year I don't have very many dead hives. But that was a good way. That way you're saving the equipment, you're saving the honey that's in there. You can use it later for a split. And that way the robber bees can't do it. And then in terms of record keeping, what I do, well, years ago, some of you may be like this, I started out where I would go in a bee yard and I had this little book and I carefully wrote down on the little book what I found in each hive. Well, I finally quit doing that when somebody showed me a much better way. So all I do when I'm working and I have my bee suit on and my bee pants, I only carry 2 tools when I'm working bees most of the time. I have a simple hive tool and I have a big black Sharpie pen, and that's pretty much what I have. And the reason is when I go through a hive, I very quickly, my covers are wood and they're painted with a white coating, which is like a mobile home roof paint, Cool Seal. It's a white paint. I could even repaint it over every few years if I want to. But it makes a really nice surface to write on. So that's what I do. You can see I have some notation. So when I'm working beehives, I have a pretty simple little notation system. What I see in the hive, I just quickly write it on the cover. It's not in a book. I'm not fumbling around going through pages trying to figure out what I did to this hive the last time I visited. As I'm going through a bee yard, I can just quickly look. As I pull up to each hive, I look at it and see what it is and see what I did the last time and what I saw. And the other thing about the way I beekeep that's unlike what some people do, I've got 350 hives. Every hive is exactly the same. Every single hive looks like this. I don't have, it's not like a hobby where I've got 7 different configurations of beehives. To me, that would just be really confusing, and it would be hard to compare hives. But when they're all exactly the same, carbon copy, I go right down the line. You pretty quickly start to notice patterns. This one is different than this one, or it just helps to have them all be the same. So when I did that February inspection, all I did was do a simple notation on the top of the hive. And what I was writing is the cluster size, which is CL, and the stores, meaning how much weight do they have. So all I did on that inspection was I just went in, took the cover off, took this off the top, broke it loose with the hive tool, lifted up this box. Because they're sitting on a clip, if you have just a regular beehive on a regular bottom board, you can just lift up the hive from the back. I can't do that as easily with these. So what I was doing was I just lift this super, feel how heavy it is, made a quick examination of how big the cluster was. Maybe the cluster's only in this box. Maybe it's in both boxes. Maybe it's in the bottom box. But I just took a quick mental note. Cluster size, 1, 2, or 3. So cluster 1 would be a real small cluster. 2 would be medium, 3 would be a big cluster. Same thing with the stores. I'm just writing down stores 1, that means they don't have a lot. 2 is good. 3 means they're super heavy. So on every single cover, that's what I did. I just wrote, you know, typically I would write, you know, this one was cluster 1, stores 2. And rain and the sun take a while to wear that away. And so the next time I come, I just look at it. And then sometimes when I get to the end of the yard, I do take a pad of paper and maybe write down a few little notes about what that yard looked like. Or the cluster 1s are the real weak ones. Those are the ones I'm worried about. So I might go back through and count the number of 1s, you know, thinking, well, this yard has 8 of them. And so I'll need to be conscious of that the next time I come. But otherwise, the record keeping is pretty simple. So I was going through hives very quickly on that first inspection, and that's all I was doing. And then on that first inspection, if I did find some where the stores were really low on these 1s, that's probably not enough honey. It's February, they probably need some help. I don't want to start feeding that early, so what I was doing was I was taking frames of honey. You know, a hive that had way too much honey, I was taking 2 or 3 or 4 frames of honey out, and I was giving it to those ones that didn't have enough honey. So early in the season, that's the easiest way, is just to swap honey between hives. Too early to start feeding. So that's kind of any questions about first inspection, early inspection? That's kind of what I was doing. And then second inspection, I just did last 3 days, February 28th and March 1st and 2nd. Got through all of them again in 3 days. That's about how many I would look through in a day, about 120. And got through them all again. And this time I was taking a little bit more time, but not a lot. And I was starting to do a little bit of feeding. And so what I did do, the ones that were the cluster 1, and I had them marked on the cover, they were the weak ones, right? So I wanted to give them all a quick check. The ones that have bigger clusters and look more normal, I'm not worried about them right now. But the ones that were a little bit weak, I was looking at them. And what I was doing was I was quickly checking on those ones where the clusters are only, say, this big right now. Some of those are queenless. Some of them, you know, there's no queen in there, and they've managed to survive the winter, but they're just a little ball of bees. Back in February, when I first looked at them, there was no brood. When I looked in the first week of February, second week of February, almost none of the hives had brood. So it wasn't really possible to tell whether those were queenless. But the ones yesterday, as I was looking through, the ones that had the little clusters, I was looking to see, they should all have brood by now. Even the small cluster hives, they should all have brood. And sure enough, that's what I was looking through. I think I had a total of about 50 or 60 that had the small clusters out of all my hives. And I think in the end, I checked them all to see if they had brood. And again, I'm not pulling out frames and looking for the queen and holding them up in the air and everything, because they're a pitiful little hive. I just wanted to know whether they're queen right. So I was just pulling the frames apart, looking down between them, and if I could see the capped brood, capped normal looking brood, hey, they're queen right, they're fine. And so that's what I did. And out of those 60, I think I found 8 that were queenless. So sure enough, some of them were queenless. They were just a pitiful little ball of bees, and when you open it, they start fanning and sounding like they're queenless. And those, I just took them and took the cluster. I put a foam plug in the entrance like that, and I took the frames of bees out and shook them on the ground, closed the bees back up, closed the hive back up, so that now that's basically a dead hive. And the bees they'll find their way into other beehives. So that increased my number of dead hives a little bit, and I figured that out. And then I did start to feed. So I fed some of the ones that were a little bit lighter. First of all, why do you feed in the spring? Sort of get an idea of what your purpose is, because if you've got normal looking hives, normal clusters, everything's looking fine, and they have plenty of stores in there, first of all, ask yourself, why are you feeding? Because if you just feed because you heard somebody tell you that you should feed bees in the spring, you could just end up creating a whole lot of swarms. As you know, if you overfeed them in the spring, they're going to just go crazy, raise a lot of brood, and swarm. But if you have a reason that you're doing it, if you've lost some hives, you're planning to make some splits and divides, sure, go ahead and start feeding those now, realizing that you're going to split them later so that you're going to knock down the swarm tendency. But be cautious with your feeding. Or a year that you lose a lot of beehives, you know you're going to have to make a lot of splits and replacements to replace them. You would feed a whole lot. This year, I've lost very little. I've lost less than 10% this year. And I'm doing less feeding because I'm not going to need to make a whole lot of splits. I need to boost some, and I need to make a few splits, but I'm trying to be a little more cautious and holding back on the feeding. So it's a little bit harder to feed this time of year because in the fall, you can use a feeder like this, and it works just fine. The bees come up in there and take the syrup out. If I tried to use this feeder right now, most of the hives, maybe some of the really strong hives, would come up into this feeder and take feed out of it. But right now, mostly they won't. The weather's a little too cool, and if it's a medium to weaker hive, you could put syrup in a feeder like this right now, and they won't take feed out of it. So be careful about doing that. My favorite way to feed bees this time of year, it may seem like a lot of labor, or is this guy crazy? He's a commercial beekeeper. I can't believe he does this, but it actually works. It works well, and it is feeding with baggies. And I'll show you how it's done. I didn't bring my tape measure. Sorry, if anybody's got a tape measure. This is about 2 3/4 inches, I believe, deep, roughly. Just a simple frame like that for baggies. It goes on the hive like that, and you take a Ziploc bag. These actually are Ziploc. First of all, they're gallon bags. Don't buy the ones that have the little plastic tab thing that slides across. Those leak terribly. So just make sure it's a regular one like this. Also, don't use the off-brand, generic brand versions. They're not well made. Stick to your top, 2 or 3 brands of these. They make them in 2 different thicknesses. They make them in what they call a storage gallon, and they make them in a freezer bag. The freezer bags are obviously thicker plastic, but I've found this is just the storage, the regular thickness, that I've found that they're fine. You don't want to put a full gallon of syrup in them. So this is what I have. You either can take this is a gallon bucket that's cut off to be about 3/4 of a gallon, and this is an ice bucket that was thrown out at a hotel, and it also holds 3/4 of a gallon. So either one of those works well, and so that's what you want. You want about 3/4 of a gallon in them, and it's really not any more labor than dealing with buckets and jars. A lot of people would just use buckets or jars because same idea, if you invert a bucket or a jar on the top of that hive, they'll draw the syrup out fine. But I just thought, I've got 400 hives. I don't want to deal with 400 buckets. I don't want to deal with 400 jars. This is actually easier to me. And so that holds 3/4 of a gallon. Got to have a razor knife, and you got to have these little blocks of wood. And these blocks of wood are 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches by 3.5 inches, and I have a nice little supply of those with me. And so if I'm going to feed with baggies, you put the bag right on top like that, and about 1 out of 7 or 8, roughly, of these leaks. And where they leak, almost all of them, if they're going to leak at all, they leak right here at this corner where the zip thing goes across. And most of them don't, but about 1 out of 7 or 8 does, and that's why I have these little blocks. And all you do is lift the corner that's leaking like that, where it puts the corner up higher than where you're slitting the top of the bag, and it works fine. And then the next time you come around, you can remove the block, but just have to have a good supply of those. You have a little razor knife about like that. You put about 3 or 4 little slits right in the top, put your rim back on, and put your cover back on. And to me, it's actually easier than a bucket because I don't have buckets to clean out, or jars to clean out, or buckets to haul around in the truck. The only negative that I see is there's a little bit of plastic waste. You're obviously throwing away the bags when you're done because you can't reuse them. If you're going to feed 3 or 4 times in a row, all you do is take the cover off. You don't even have to pull up the other bag that's already in there. You just lay the next bag right on top of it, and then at the end of the spring, when you end up feeding, you just take all the bags off.
So your fall feeding that you do and your spring feeding, is the syrup different?
Fall feeding was all 2 to 1, basically thick sugar syrup, 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, or roughly the equivalent of that. You want to get the feed on there quickly. They're bulking up for winter, and you don't want to make them have to evaporate all that water out of it. In the spring, I make it more dilute. Anywhere from 1.5 to 1 to 1 to 1. So 1.5 parts sugar to 1 part sugar. Somewhere in that range. The stuff that I just put on the last 3 days, I did at 1.5. So it's kind of midway in between. Like I said, I don't have a lot of dead hives. I'm not trying to really stimulate them, but I'm just trying to give the ones that need it some sugar. So that's been my compromise. But if you really want to give it to them and make them raise brood quickly, just go with the straight 1 to 1.
And that's by weight, not volume.
And it works the same. With sugar and water are exactly the same by volume of weight. So there you go. Yeah, a pint of sugar weighs a pound, and a pint of water weighs a pound. So you can either weigh it, or you can use a measuring container, and it works the same either way. One of the interesting little thing about that. So I lost my pad. There you go. So anyway, that's kind of any other feeding. Oh, and so the other thing you can obviously do this time of year, if you choose to, is you can use some type of a pollen supplement patty. This is one that I actually made by just mixing it myself, buying the powdered stuff and mixing it at home. You can also buy them already pre-made. And so it's a useful tool. Again, the question would be, do you need it? If you're trying to stimulate them more, then use this stuff. If you think they're fine and they don't really need it, then there's no point in using it. In our area, we have a huge diversity of pollen. And if the weather's good here in the spring, we have a huge amount of pollen coming in. So they're getting plenty. But this gives them a little extra. If you're going to use it, we're in an area with a lot of small hive beetle issues. Not as badly as down out of the mountains, but still some. And so you have to be careful with this. Don't overfeed. This is about a pound. Most of the time, in this time of year, I probably wouldn't put on more than half this. I might divide this in half and give it to 2 hives. If you're going to use it, you want to put it right in the center of the cluster. So if the cluster, let's say, was in both of these boxes, I'd lift the super, smoke the bees so you're not smashing the bees. Put it right in the middle of the cluster where there's bees above it and below it. And only put in there what they will eat up in 5 to 7 days. If it's longer than 5 to 7 days, that gives time enough for the hive beetles to come lay a whole bunch of eggs in it. And you pull up the next time you crack the thing open and you peel it back, it'll be just completely covered with the little maggots of the small hive beetle. So we've learned that way that you need to be careful with that. But it's useful. You can feed it all through March and April. It'll give them a little bit of, there's stuff coming in. There's also, we'll get 5 or 6 days of rainy, cold weather, even in April, and they're sitting in there eating away on the patty, even though they can't fly out and get natural stuff. So it's a useful tool. I've gone back and forth. Some years I don't use it at all. Some years I do. This year I'm probably doing it less. I really am not planning on doing it a lot this year again because I had very few losses. So it's extra work, it's extra expense, and definitely not as big of an issue. So now going forward, I've already inspected them twice. I still haven't done a lot of manipulation down in the brood nest or anything, but I'll be doing that pretty soon. So after March 10th, I'll probably go in them and really start trying to work them a little bit more. And some of the stuff I'll talk about that we do. You're equalizing hives, you're equalizing the strength between hives, you're doing some swarm prevention, and those things kind of go together. And then eventually, too, if I'm trying to replace losses or sell nukes. You know, I'm going to be splitting and making nukes. So those are kind of some of the things that are coming up that we're thinking about doing and trying to figure that out. One of the most useful things I did of learning how to manage for spring and reduce swarming and do all that, interestingly enough, was when I started to really commit on a large scale to doing apple pollination. Asheville's has a huge apple growing area just to the south of us in Hendersonville, the biggest apple area in North Carolina. And for years, I took as many as 300 hives to the apple orchards. And so it's a lot of work, very, very intense work. You're paid well for it. Not as well as if you're doing almonds, but you're still paid pretty well. The going rate now is something between $75 and $100 a hive, depending on who you're renting to. But the reason it helped me figure out spring management was when you're renting hives for apples, you're expected to deliver a product, a very consistent product, year after year. The hives are the same strength, and you're expected to deliver it on time. And so you had to figure out, how do I manage my hives to make that happen? It just so happens that that also helps you to prevent swarms. And once I learned how to do it. And the goal always, that you read it in the books, and then they also kind of tell you what they want when you deliver hives for apple pollination. In the average now, the apples start to bloom around the 5th of April in Edneyville. Now, that can be a little bit one side or the other, but it's around the 5th of April. And they want you to deliver a hive that has the equivalent of 6 frames of brood to the orchards at that point. If it's less than, and by that I mean deep frames, more or less, the whole frame is not completely covered with brood, but probably half or more of the frames are covered with brood, and they want you to have 6 frames. If it's less than that, they feel like they're not getting their money's worth for what they're paying you. There's not enough bees in there, just like with almonds, there's not enough bees. Why should we be paying you to do that? If you have lots more brood in there than that, let's say you have 8 or 9 frames of brood, hey, they love it. You're bringing all these nice extra bees for to pollinate their apples. But if you have hives that are that strong, April the 5th, they're very likely going to swarm. It's a really strong hive. And often, they'll swarm in the apple orchard while you have them there. So I think that was a pretty good deal for the first 5 or 6 days that they're sitting there. And then these great big old swarms come storming out of the hives. They always land right nearby on these apple trees because they're so low. And they'll call you up and say, you got 3 swarms hanging out here in these trees. And suddenly half the bees flew away, so you just lost probably most of your force that was going to make your honey crop. They lost half the bees that were pollinating their apples. You're getting paid to pollinate the apples, but now you just lost the honey crop. And believe me, you can make more money from the honey than you can from the pollinating of the apple. So it was always this sort of thing, do I really want to do this? Is it really worth it? Or am I better off just leaving my bees at home where I can take better care of them, because they're not all scattered out into 15 apple orchards. I can take better care of them, and maybe I can control the swarming a little bit better, and don't I come out better than, even than being paid by the apple farmer? So this kind of, Dave here has done the same thing. So there's always this balance. So I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do the apple thing, I've got to really figure out how to manage the hives well, where I'm doing both things at the same time, where I'm pollinating the apples and I am controlling the swarming. And that way you're making money from both the honey and the pollination. So that was the trick of how to pull all that off. And it actually ended up, once I've learned how to do it and figured it out, it wasn't that bad. So then the next inspection that I do, which will probably be around between March 10th and March 15th, I'll start really going through the hives better. And so, as where before, all I was worried about is the cluster and the stores. Now I want to actually know how many frames of brood are in each hive. So that's the next time I go through, that's what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to count the number of frames of brood in each hive. And I'm going to write that on the cover just like I did before. And now, even if you went in there now, there's a variety of things. Some hives have just a small cluster that's up here only. Some have a cluster that's pretty much just in the bottom box. and this upper box is still mostly honey. Some have the cluster that's in both boxes. So you'll see all those as you're going through them. And then when I'm counting frames of brood, you know, sometimes they're going to be up here in the medium. So I sort of figure, well, if it's a medium frame of brood, that's only half a frame of brood. So if there were 4 up here, then I'd count that as 2. But if they're in the bottom, you know, I'd count them as a full frame. So there's some of that. You have to kind of figure that out. This once I kind of get a grasp of how many frames of brood are in each hive, I write it on the cover. Then I can start doing equalizing, which is what I'll do a lot of for the next month or so. And the whole idea with equalizing, again, is you want to just get them all as close as possible in strength leading into that first week or so in April. There are several ways to equalize. One of them is you can simply, which reminds me, I'm going to turn my phone on. I don't think I did. I'm awful. You can simply swap the positions of the hives. Does anybody ever do that? Anybody in this group done it some? It's doable. It's probably my least favorite way to do it, but literally you can take, a hive that sits here and a hive that sits over there. This one's strong, that one's weaker. You can literally, on a good, nice, warm, sunny day, you can just switch the 2 positions. The bees surprisingly don't fight much. It's very rare that you would lose a queen that way. All that you're really doing is you're giving the weaker hive the field force of the stronger hive. You're not giving them any brood. You're not giving them any of the eggs or the young brood or any of that. All you're doing is kind of giving them some older field bees. And they'll go into that weaker hive when you switch positions, and it does. It works pretty well. You got to be careful doing it. You wouldn't want to do it where you had a super strong hive and a really, really weak hive. You don't want that kind of difference between the 2 of them, but if the difference is more moderate, you can switch the 2 positions. And that does work, but like I said, it's probably the one that I do the least. The second way is that you simply move frames of bees and brood, which means you're going into a hive that's stronger. And again, if I've written all those numbers on the top covers, now I can go right down the line. This hive had 6 frames of brood. That one had 3 frames. That one had 2. That one had 5. It's written on the covers. And all I'm doing then at that point is literally taking whole frames of bees, the brood and all the bees that are clinging to both sides of the frame. And I'm simply moving it to a weaker hive. Again, you don't want to do it too severely, like, you don't want to take a hive that's too weak and give it too much brood. If you do it in the same yard that like if you're pulling brood out of this hive and moving it over to that hive, realize that some of those bees are going to fly back. The ones that have been out and seen the world, they're going to actually fly back to their original hive. So you got to be a little bit careful about that too. Also, the hive that's donating the brood and the bees, you're going to have to actually go through and find the queen. So you make sure that you're not picking her up on the frame and giving her to the other hive. So that involves a little bit of work. You don't have to find the queen in the weaker hive that you're giving the brood to, but you do have to find the queen in the hive that you're taking brood from. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. This box is a useful box. You can use this. This is simply a brood box that has some ventilation on the bottom, ventilation on the top like that. And as you're going along in a yard, if you don't want to go back and mess with a hive twice, if you find a hive that's got a lot of brood and you think that's one of the stronger ones in the yard and you can take some brood from it, you could go ahead and take the frames of brood and bees and temporarily put them in this box. And then when you got down to the weaker one and you found the weaker one down here, now you can just take it out of that box and not have to go back through that one again. So that's useful. Also, what I do quite a bit of is I'll move brood to a different bee yard. I have 10 different bee yards. So if I actually have some extra frames of brood, I can move it to another bee yard. Then the field bees aren't going to fly back to the original hive. They're going to stay with the ones that you're moving. So that can be useful for doing that too.
How many frames of brood do you leave in your main hive